With the recent release of Alan Wake 2, it felt only appropriate to go back and break down the full story of the first Alan Wake game that was actually remastered just back in 2021. Now, I've thought of quite a few ways to break this story down for you guys, since the way in which the narrative is told is quite unique, since part of the game actually reveals to you future events through manuscripts that you find. So, for the purposes of this video and not repeating myself a heap, I will be skipping the manuscripts that explain future things that we actually see. Instead, I will go over the scripts that give background detail into things that we do not see firsthand, of which there's only a few. Just wanted to add, we will be covering all of the first Alan Wake game, the Alan Wake Files book that expands on the story, the 2 Alan Wake novels, and some added story points that you can find in the games Control and Quantum Break, so minor spoilers for those 2 games as well. So with all of that in mind, it's time to break down Alan Wake 1. I hope you enjoy it. We begin with a panning shot of the surrounding nature, with Alan Wake giving a voiceover about a favourite horror writer of his, Stephen King. You might have heard of him. He mentions that King once wrote that nightmares exist outside of logic, and there's little fun to be had in explanations. They're antithetical to the poetry of fear, and even if the character is always wondering why, you can't answer that question, since the unanswered mystery is what stays with us the longest, and the one that people remember till the end. This is something that Alan Wake, a horror writer himself, has held on to throughout his career. He goes on to say that he has always had a vivid imagination. This particular dream of his, though, was pretty dark and weird, even by his standards. In his dream, he was late and trying his best to reach his destination, a lighthouse, but he couldn't remember why. But during his driving, he hit a hitchhiker in the middle of the road, ultimately killing him. Well, that is until the hitchhiker just disappears. Wake makes his way towards the lighthouse, the destination that he's been trying to get to this whole time, when our former roadkill is back, standing next to the car and then right next to Alan. This mysterious shadow man points out to Alan that he should recognize him, and questions if Alan thinks that he's a god, playing with people's lives and killing them to add to the drama whenever he sees fit, before pointing out that his books are worthless and not even worth the paper that they're printed on. I think you could say that this is a case of internal judgment on the part of Alan Wake, since the hitchhiker is one of his characters from his book, and his own work is telling him just how bad he is at what he does, really putting forward the saying that I am my own worst critic. On a nearby board there are a few things. Firstly, a missing poster of Alan Wake, and a diver's suit. This diver's suit might seem like nothing now, but please do take an internal note of this, since it will come back and make more sense later on. Also, there's a QR code that will take you to an unlisted video to do with the Alan Wake game, made by the creators, if that's your sort of thing. Refrain from doing that right now, but remember to come back here and have a look at it when you're done, I suppose. Alan is helped inside by a guy that attempts to kill the hitchhiker with a gun, but apparently, the saying of never bring a knife to a gunfight doesn't apply to a big-ass fire axe. We can see an eye on the television. Again, take note of the eye on the television, it will make more sense later. When Alan gets outside, a bright light with a voice speaks to him, advising him to stay in the light as it will keep him safe, and goes on to mention a poem. For he did not know that beyond the lake he called home lies a deeper, darker ocean green, where waves are both wilder and more serene. To its ports I've been. Alan tells the light that he doesn't understand what the heck it's talking about and what it means, before the light responds saying that it's entered his dream to teach him. The darkness is dangerous, and it's currently sleeping, but when it feels Alan coming, it will wake up, and it needs to teach Wake something important, and very quickly. The hitchhiker and enemies are guarded by the darkness, protecting them, and the only way to rid them of that protection is to use light, before providing a flashlight and a gun. Wake takes note that within his dream the world is being consumed by darkness, and the lighthouse is the only safe place left. There are literal darkness tornadoes, but Wake does make it to the lighthouse. But the darkness outside is encroaching quickly. Alan is woken by his wife Alice as they are currently sitting on a ferry, waiting to arrive at Bright Falls. It's a small town, but a welcoming sight for Wake, since this will act as a holiday for him and his wife. We meet a man on the ferry as well, this older gentleman. His name is Pat Main. He is a local of the town and mentions that an event is coming up in a few weeks, called Deerfest. It's a whole hunting show and contest. He recognizes Alan Wake and mentions to him that he's a fan, before asking Alan to take part in his radio station for an interview, since he turns out to be the host of a local station. Wake declines, saying that he's here simply for a low-key holiday with the missus and doesn't want the world to know that he's here, in case fans travel to try and meet him. Pat agrees, but states that the offer still stands should Wake change his mind. Also, normally I wouldn't include this in the video, but I really want to put it in here since it absolutely killed me when it happened. The first time I saw this cutscene, it looked like this. I have no idea what this bug was, but the idea that a rainbow box was being the town's radio host just absolutely killed me. But a simple restart got it fixed and we can continue on with the story. Alan gets a phone call from his very energetic agent, Barry. Barry is calling to check that Alan has made it to Bright Falls safely and hopes that the new change of scenery could help get his creative juices flowing again. But Alan is not very impressed by this. We arrive at the town and can see a big Deerfest float going by on the street as the town gets ready for the event. As for Alan and Alice, they head to a local diner to meet with Carl Stuckey, since he has a key to a cabin that they will be staying at while they're in Bright Falls. Alan gets a very friendly welcome when he enters the diner, with a whole cardboard cutout of himself standing there to greet him. The cutout belongs to the waitress at the diner. She's named Rose. She is his biggest fan and is absolutely ecstatic to meet Alan, and mentions that Carl is in the restroom. We get to look around the diner and meet some people. Firstly, the local ranger named Rusty, who was enjoying a morning coffee and a newspaper. And then there's these two old fellas. One of them asks Alan to put the Coconut song on the jukebox for him since it's his favourite song. And he has some issues getting up with his legs going numb from poor circulation.
Yes! This is it. I've died and gone to hell.
I mean, what a moment. It turns out that these two are retired rock and roll musicians and happen to be two brothers. There's also a woman standing looking into the darkness down the hallway. She warns Alan about going down there, saying that he could actually die if he did, and that she warned Carl about it and he didn't listen. Alan doesn't care, of course, because he's not scared of some bathroom darkness. After all, he is a horror writer. When he knocks on the door, a woman appears beside him, telling Alan that Carl couldn't make it and has fallen ill. Instead, she will provide him with a cabin key and instructions on how to get to the lake, and we'll check on him a bit later to make sure that he and his wife have settled in nicely. In the creepiest goddamn way possible, by the way. As Alan leaves the hallway, the woman warns him to again be careful in the dark and intends to tell Sarah to replace the light bulbs. The two older gentlemen tell us about their hernias before incorrectly addressing Alan as Tom, saying that it's been a long time and it's good to see him. Alan doesn't bother correcting them, instead leaving to head back to the cabin with Alice. While they drive away, Carl Stuckey comes out of the diner, yelling for them to stop since they forgot their cabin keys, nursing what seems to be some kind of head injury. Alice tells Alan that she hopes that this time away will help him ride again, to which Alan gets annoyed, telling her that he will figure it out when they get home. He just wants to enjoy his goddamn holiday. We hear from some narration that explains that Alan hasn't written one word for a book in over 2 years since he's finished his last book, suffering from writer's block. We get our first glimpse of the cabin as Roy Orbison's In Dreams plays in the background. Really setting the tone of what's to come. The cabin itself is really scenic, and not the complete horror show that I thought it was going to be when Alan got the key from that creepy woman. We come to learn that Alice has a severe phobia of the dark. So bad, in fact, that we need to head into the cabin quickly before nightfall and make sure that the power and the lights are working correctly. We get the generator on and head inside. We find a box filled with books from a Thomas Zane. Alan makes a mention that he's never heard of Zane before, which is a bit surprising since he has so many books released. The radio outside has the local radio channel on, and we hear none other than our friend Pat Main from the ferry. He mentions that he met a famous rider on the ferry to Bright Falls today, but out of respect won't mention who. Ruby, the woman from the diner, calls in to mention that she met Alan today in the diner. This annoys the heck out of Alan since he just wanted to stay low-key, but hopefully not many people outside of Bright Falls listens to Pat Main's radio show. We head upstairs to meet Alice and can find a typewriter with a bunch of paper next to it. It turns out that Alice wanted to help Alan with his writer's block and planned this whole trip as a refuge away from the city for him to concentrate on his writing. She even mentions a local doctor in Bright Falls called Hartman. She read in a book who helps troubled artists recapture the creative side. This infuriates Alan as he storms outside to the darkness since he knows that she won't follow him due to her phobia. The lights in the cabin turn off as Alice is screaming for Ellen to help her. We can hear her scream as the sound of a big splash can be heard. Ellen sees Alice in the water and jumps in to help her. This is where things get a little weird. We can see the creepy lady from before telling Ellen to keep going when he wakes up in his car, hurt from a car crash. Ellen has no memory of how he got into the car or the crash. The last thing he remembers is Alice falling into the water and he jumping in to save her. In the back of the car was a book from Dr. Hartman, a cold reminder of Ellen's fight with Alice shortly before she fell. He feels guilty. We see a nearby gas station that seems like a reasonable location to find a phone, since our cell phone was damaged in the car crash, but this would require a long haul through the forest. I really hope Ellen has car insurance, because this is not getting fixed, I'm sorry to tell you. As Ellen walks through the forest, a light appears as pieces of paper fall to his feet. The papers were pages of a manuscript for the book named Departure. This was the same name that Ellen planned to use for his next novel, but he never started writing it. The author was titled Alan Wake, but he had never written it, nor remembers writing it. In this scene, the hero is attacked during the night by an axe murderer in the woods. We find a lumber mill nearby, and since the lights were on, we could use their phone instead of having to go all the way to the gas station. Fortunately, we find Carl Stuckey. Unfortunately, old Carl isn't quite himself at the moment, as he appears to be surrounded in some type of dark presence. Did I mention? He's wielding a big-ass fire axe. Interesting how appropriate that is given the manuscript we just found, but I'm sure it's just a coincidence. It turns out that Carl Stuckey is a real big Jack Nicholson fan, as we need to find a phone and find it quickly. We reach the sheriff's station and Carl destroys the phone line. He goes on to say, screw it, the phone line isn't enough, let's just destroy the whole goddamn building while we're at it. A narrow escape later and we begin to find ourselves surrounded by these shadow people. Ellen notes that he has never fired a gun before, but after shooting these people, they disappeared. No body left behind. Ellen thought he was dreaming, but if he is, this is real enough to make him sick. We can find a manuscript in the nearby woods. This one explains how Rose felt meeting Ellen for the very first time in the diner, feeling that it was the high point of her life. She saw Ellen get into the car with his wife, and she was pretty and confident. Unlike Rose, they were perfect together, and Rose would have done anything to be called their friend. Another script shows how Ellen's agent Barry has been over the last week. It explains that Barry was bouncing off the walls. He jumped on a plane after his calls were being ignored by Ellen and Alice for several days. After knowing Ellen for years, he could tell that something was wrong and flew out immediately to find out what. Throughout the journey, Ellen can find these symbols painted with a paint that's only visible when hit by the light. They give hints and advise on the darkness and how to deal with it, while providing flares, weaponry, and batteries to help whoever found it out with the Taken, the name used to describe these shadow people. Ellen finds another radio that has Pat Maine's radio show on, as he interviews a man explaining that his normally well-behaved dog got interested in something in the bushes near the woods while they were walking in the dark, darting off into the bushes and never returning. He asked Pat to keep an eye out for him, just another sign of strange occurrences that are going on in the town. We can also find a television that plays a short horror scenes from a show named Night Springs, something to keep note of. Take an eternal thought there on that one as well. Ellen gets cornered by Carl Stuckey and the other Taken at the lumber mill, but is able to get the best of them before continuing on to the gas station. Thankfully, we can find out what happened to Carl in a manuscript that you can find. It states that Carl was having trouble with what felt like cobwebs in his mind. Ever since the couple never showed up for the keys, things have been fuzzy for him. Something caught his attention, a horror that his brain even failed to process. He stumbled back, struggling against it, but only for a brief moment before letting go as the unrelenting darkness engulfed him. At the gas station, we can find the deer float that we saw when we arrived at Bright Falls. What is, however, truly concerning is a countdown board that counts down the days until Deerfest. When Ellen and Alice arrived, it was 2 weeks until Deerfest, but this board was saying that Deerfest is only in a week's time, meaning that Ellen has somehow lost a whole week between what happened at the cabin and current time. Inside the gas station is another television, but this time it isn't Night Springs. Instead, it's video footage of Ellen speaking to himself in a writing room within the cabin. Ellen is speaking about how there is only darkness outside the cabin and story. He can feel Alice's presence in the dark. Her perfume was in the room. He plans to reach her to bring her back. The story needs to come true. If it doesn't, she'll be lost forever. This obviously freaks Alan the hell out, as I think it would almost anybody, stating that he was talking like a madman on the television, and wonders if he is losing his mind. We use the phone to contact the police and the sheriff of the town. Sarah arrives and Alan tells her about the car crash, and that he and his wife have been staying on this island on Cauldron Lake. Sarah mentions that there is no island on Cauldron Lake, not since the big eruption in the 70s. Alan asks for Sarah to take them to the lake to show her before falling to the ground. She asks about Carl Stuckey and if we know where he is, but Alan realizes that he can't really tell Sarah everything that's happened, since there's no way that she could possibly believe a word that he's saying. He lies and says that he doesn't, hoping to keep her trust and find Alice. They arrive back at the lake and Alan realizes that there's no cabin or island at Cauldron Lake, seemingly disappearing into the water. We see a flashback 3 years earlier in Alan and Alice's New York apartment. The conversation is very casual, as we can see that Alice is responsible for Alan's cover mock-ups for his book, a series that has just finished after killing off his main character called Casey, deciding to go in a different direction. The lights go out and we have another situation that highlights Alice's phobia of the dark. Alan comforts her and tells her a story about his childhood, saying that when he was a child, the dark scared him also. When it got really bad, his mother gave him an old light switch that he called the clicker. If Alan ever got scared in the dark, he would flip the switch and a magical light would scare all the monsters in the dark away. He gives this clicker to Alice to use when she gets scared. She thinks that he just made up the whole thing, but finds it comforting all the same. We head back to present time as Alan is being checked by the Bright Falls doctor. He realizes that he can't tell the doctor about his headache and memory loss, since he would 100% be sent to the hospital for further tests, and he needs to find Alice, and fast. Alan leaves the office and we can see that we are actually at the sheriff's office. There is a whole list of people missing on the board, possibly related to the darkness. The real tragedy, however, is this missing cat. If I could change the course of the story, I would be looking for that little guy. The weird woman from the diner is speaking to the front desk of the sheriff's office, telling them to remember to update their light bulbs, just like she did at the diner. That woman's name is Cynthia Weaver. She used to be the editor for a local newspaper, but has become a bit of an eccentric. She focuses on other things these days. We can find a few things within the office, including a manuscript page that describes when Alice looked at the Cauldron Lake cabin through the viewfinder. Apparently, Alice noticed a figure standing behind the cabin in the shadows, a thin woman in a black dress, but when she looked again, there was nobody, just a human-looking bush, and just laughed it off. We can also hear the police radio speaking about Carl Stuckey being missing, and they have searched the gas station and found absolutely no sign of him, but someone trashed the garage. They're finding his disappearance more and more suspicious. Alan speaks with Sarah, the local sheriff, but before he could get into discussing the details, his phone rings. On the other end of the phone is Alice asking Alan for help, before another man tells Alan to stop speaking to the law if he wants to see his wife again, telling him to leave the station and check the broken junker behind the building. Alan is to meet with him at Elderwood National Park after he ditches the cops. On our way out, we find a drunk guy complaining about being in the dark. We help him out, turn the lights on, since we aren't complete animals, and leave the station. Inside the junker outside was Alice's driver's license, proof from the kidnapper that he is legitimate. The phone rings again, but this time it's Alan's agent, Barry, who is relieved that Alan finally answered. He tells Alan that he is in Bright Falls after flying in to check on him. Alan tells Barry to come pick him up from the sheriff's office. Alan can see himself again on the television, this time speaking to himself how the writer is the light that reveals his story from the darkness, shaping it from nothing like a sculptor carves a statue from a block of granite. He feels if he stops writing that the world he is responsible for dies, and the darkness will reclaim it once again, something that he cannot allow since Alice's life is on the line. He will continue to write the story. He will save her. We speak to the sheriff as we find Dr. Hartman, the same doctor that Alice brought Alan to Bright Falls to in order to see. He offers Alan a place at his clinic and he would like to help him with his issues, something that Alan is not much of a fan of as he gives him a quick right hook. Big Barry arrives and informs everyone to get their hands off his client, threatening to use his lawyers to sue the crap out of a lot of them. We leave and Alan tells Barry everything. Initially, Barry just thought that Alan had just gone to the loony bin, but but after hearing about the manuscript and the fact that Alan was writing again, he smelled money, but he did believe that Alice was kidnapped. Alan and Barry rent a cabin near Elderwood National Park, so the walk out to the meeting point is nice and quick. We see Rose again as she was bringing Rusty some coffee. She fangirls a bit about Alan, but Barry mentions that she really did help him a lot with finding Alan. Barry continues to question Alan's story, asking if he has been drinking or maybe was on a bender since he's arrived here, to which Alan denies. We find Rusty tending to good boy Max. This is the same park ranger that we saw in the diner when we first arrived at Bright Falls. We organize the cabin with him as Barry continues to question Alan's intentions on meeting with a kidnapper alone, since, these situations normally end very terribly. Alan doesn't feel that there are any other options, but Barry thinks that going to the cops or the FBI would be a better option. Alan points out that they will just kill her if he does that, and he's not risking it. We leave Barry in the cabin as we head out on our own to begin our walk down the nature trail towards our meeting point. We can find a manuscript that mentions how Barry never got along with Alice, but he understood just how much she meant to Alan. Barry is terrified for Alan, worried that he has had a psychotic episode after losing Alice. Another page speaks of how Rose knows Rusty's true feelings for her, that he was in love with her. See, Rose likes him too, a lot in fact. He had taught her how to dance, he was gentle, he made her smile and feel good. But Rusty wasn't who she imagined getting with. She was looking for her Prince Charming, but she was self-aware enough to know that she was no closer to the Hollywood magic than he was. We get back to the main building that we found Rusty in when he was treating the dog earlier. We can hear screaming coming from the inside, screaming for help. We head inside and see Rusty. He has been severely injured by the darkness. He was thrown across the lobby and hit the wall pretty damn hard. It didn't hurt until he tried to get up and saw his leg pointing the wrong way. Not to mention the broken rib that's stabbing him from the inside. He was afraid to die here alone. Rusty mentions that he read the manuscript page that described his injuries before it happened, that the darkness did it, and he gives Alan some keys to use to turn the lights on and the power on for the building again. On a brighter note, the dog does seem to be uninjured, and is currently chilling in his cage, so that's something. We find the circuit breaker and somebody has destroyed it with an axe. We can hear screams again as sounds of smashing can be heard back where Rusty was. When we get back there, Rusty's missing, and I'm going to take a wild guess and say that the giant hole in the wall probably has something to do with it. Outside, we find Rusty, however, he has been turned by the darkness, and we have to fight him, eventually killing him. We can find another manuscript that gives us a little bit more insight into the last moments of Rusty. In his final moment of consciousness, he thought of Rose. He was much older than Rose, and she was barely out of her teens, but she made him feel young, helping him forget his train wreck of a long-dead marriage. He still wore his wedding ring, waiting for the day that Rose would tell him to take it off. Now, that day would never come. Barry calls Alan again and mentions that he saw the attack on Rusty's building from his cabin, and that he now realizes that Alan wasn't crazy after all. We continue further into the trail as we find another page describing an FBI agent named Nightingale. It mentions how he didn't want to come to Bright Falls since small communities, for whatever reason, revolted him. He was a drunk and wanted to turn around and just pass out on the side of the road, but he had a job to do and a rider to catch. Alan is very close to being a pile of goo at the bottom of a mountain ridge by narrowly getting across a valley. A man helps him from a bunch of taken that surround him, giving him items to deal with them. Alan recognizes the man. He was on the ferry when we first arrived at Bright Springs with Alice, and he also knew Alan's name, and also which direction to head to get to the meeting point. These were not coincidences. This guy was the kidnapper. We arrive at the location and question him about Alice. He mentions that he has already read the pages and knew what Alan was going to say before he even said them. Praising him for his writing, he makes Alan an offer. He wants the full manuscript in return for Alice, threatening to hurt her if Alan doesn't comply. Alan punches him and they both fall down below before the kidnapper makes a run for it. Alan has no manuscript for him, only the pages he has found along the way, but it's far from the full thing. Speaking of manuscript, we find another. It speaks on Alice's view of the dark and that she sees it as something malicious and malign. Things wrapped in darkness would become something else, something foreign, and nothing in it was safe or innocent any longer. A description of the darkness that Alan is only now truly understanding. The woods were dark and full of taken, and if the already strange events of the night weren't enough, A plane fell out of the sky, except the plane was aged. This thing hasn't seen maintenance for decades, yet it somehow just crashed right in front of us. Ellen has only one option left: to return to Barry and to come up with a new plan to save Alice. We find another television that shows Ellen once again. He talks about the art of storytelling, that a story is like a beast that has life of its own. You can create it, you can shape it, but if you change one thing, you can set off a chain reaction. The character needs to be true to themselves. Events must follow logic that fit the world of the story. A single flaw and the magic is gone. The story dies, and in return, Alice dies. The kidnapper rings our phone and tells Wake that he wants the manuscript. Ellen pleads for more time, asking for a week to finish it since he hasn't actually written the ending yet. The kidnapper gives him 2 days and tells him to meet at the Bright Falls coal mine. Barry mentions to us that the cabin is surrounded by ravens, saying that he needs help. Thankfully, he boarded up the windows, but some did get through the chimney like a nightmarish Santa Claus. We do some early bird hunting and get back into the cabin with Barry. He apologizes for thinking that we were crazy. A bit later, Ellen sends Barry into town to ask around for a man that fits the description of the kidnapper, going through local newspapers, looking to learn anything that he can about the kidnapper and, more importantly, the cabin that just disappeared. Ellen attempts to write a manuscript for the kidnapper, but he can't manage to put a single word to paper, startled by the fact that the supernatural has become reality. Barry gets a call from Rose saying that she's found Ellen's pages and to meet her at the trailer park outside of town. However, she sounds a lot different than her normal self. Rose is normally cheery and outgoing. This sounded more like a robot, very mechanical in her speaking with no emotion. We can see that she's been influenced by the lady in black, making her contact Barry to bait them into the trailer park. Ellen and Barry meet with the manager of the park, who leads them to Rose's trailer. Barry fills Ellen in on what he found during his research, and he's got some interesting stuff. Firstly, there has been a lot of weird stuff going on in the town according to the local newspaper's archives. Disappearances, mysterious deaths, urban legends, and almost all of these things happen around Cauldron Lake. The trailer park manager verifies Barry's claims, saying that the Indians thought that the lake was a doorway to the underworld, but of course he didn't buy into that himself. Barry confirms that there once was an island there, owned by a guy named Thomas Zane. Some articles point him out as being a very famous writer, but even after a bunch of searches, Barry couldn't find a single thing that he wrote. If you remember back when Ellen went into the Cauldron Lake cabin, there was a bunch of books sitting on the desk written by Thomas Zane. Interestingly, Thomas Zane was really into diving, and he had this place called Diver's Isle. But after the volcano under the lake erupted in 1970, Zane was presumed killed with the island and the cabin. The manager points out a broken boat that appeared at the trailer park in the morning, similar to the plane that we found in the woods. Ironically, the manager doesn't seem all that fazed on how a 40-foot boat ended up in the middle of his park, but he's just happy it didn't hit any of the trailers since that would be bad for business. Anyway, back to what Barry was speaking about. It turns out that a local girl named Barbara Jagger drowned at Cauldron Lake just 1 week before the eruption. Thomas Zane and Barbara Jagger were lovers. The manager points out that Jagger is a local spooky story. People call her the scathing hag. She comes for you in the dark, something he puts down to a childish story. Barry mentions that the person who wrote all the articles about Zane and Jagger was a woman named Cynthia Weaver. She is the light bulb lady that we met at the diner and also the woman that spoke to the sheriff's office about updating their light bulbs. Barry points out that Cynthia knew Zane and Jagger before their deaths and thinks that she had a mental breakdown afterwards, hence why people in the town call her the lamp lady or crazy lady. We reach Rose's trailer and speak to Rose, still doing her very creepy, emotionless voice. We sit down for coffee and it turns out that the coffee was spiked with some strong crap. Both Barry and Ellen fall unconscious and Ellen begins dreaming as the light from his dream speaks to him again, telling him that something is coming for him, hiding in Barbara's skin, and it's too weak to stop it, commanding Ellen to turn the lights on. The woman in black returns, telling Ellen that she did promise to visit him and his wife at the cabin, and tells him that he must finish what he started. Ellen awakes in Rose's room, jump scared by the woman in black. Don't mind the countless pictures of Ellen on the wall, by the way. Rose was a big fan after all. A television is playing in the background of Ellen again. On the television, Ellen is speaking to himself, saying that he can't tell reality from dreams anymore. and that his imaginary editor is there to help him. She's an old woman in a funeral dress called Barbara Jagger, stating that she is very strict and that she is revising large portions of his story. The edits get more and more aggressive, and the story is less of Alan's and more of hers. But Barbara has promised Alan that this will save Alice. Barbara even told him that she worked with a previous writer under similar circumstances, called Thomas Zane. Alan mentions that the genre of the Departure book he is writing is more and more shifting towards a horror story, but he is getting close. Now this has some big reveals. Firstly, the woman in black is Barbara Jagger, and judging by what the light in Alan's dreams was saying, the light seems to be Thomas Zane, helping Alan traverse the situation that he's in, which is fitting since it seems he once dealt with the same situation himself, according to Jagger and Alan on the television. Barry is completely KO'd on the table, like my man just hit 30 shots of tequila back to back. And as for Rose, she is continuing to talk to herself in her new normal emotionless version of herself, but Alan understands that it's not her fault. However, this little detour has lost Alan an entire day, and he now only has 12 hours left to get the manuscript to the kidnapper before something bad happens to his wife. We find a manuscript page outside the trailer, detailing what the trailer park manager thought of the past 12 hours that we just lost. He felt that Alan and Barry were trouble, and they have now been in there for hours, way past her normal bedtime. He called the sheriff's office. We can find another radio as Pat Main has a guest named Walt on. It turns out that Walt is the drunk guy from the sheriff's station that we turned the lights on for. He got out on bail and he went to see his best friend Danny. However, and he doesn't go into detail here, but there seems to have been an argument of some kind, which has really freaked out and upset Walt. He mentions to Pat that something feels off about the sky tonight, as if something is weird. Pat doesn't really understand what he means, but this will come back later. We need to get our car in order to move unconscious Barry into it. And as we get to the gate, there are police cars everywhere. And we even meet FBI Nightingale, the same person that we read about earlier in the manuscript. They were called by the manager and want Alan to put his hands up. It turns out that this FBI agent breaks almost every single rule in the police handbook and starts just unloading clips like he's at the range. Let's not forget the innocent manager man right there is also in the way as well. Alan takes off into the woods, as anybody would, and Alan was now being pursued by the police through those woods. Feeling bad for leaving Barry at the trailer, but he had no time. He needed to get his wife back. We can find a manuscript page in the woods that gives us a bit more information about the darkness, saying that the same thing that wears Barbara Jagger's skin slept fitfully in its home in prison. It dreamed of nights of glory when the poet's writing called it from the depths and gave it power, albeit brief. It mentions how the rock stars stirred it from its sleep, but the poet sank it back down. However, when it sensed the rider on the ferry, it opened its eyes once more. The rock stars being mentioned are the two old guys from the beginning. They said that they were once rock stars, and it was mentioned that they were staying at Hartman's Lodge. Throughout, we can find numerous damaged police vehicles. However, despite the catastrophic damage to the car, somehow the police radios are still working. We can hear the local sheriff, Sarah, addressing Nightingale. She is very displeased about the FBI's itchy trigger finger, and just overall general conduct, calling him out for almost hitting a civilian. Nightingale argues back, saying that he has more important things to worry about, but to her credit, Sarah doesn't back down, saying that she is on her way to talk to him. The darkness is doing an absolute number on the police forces in the woods, by the way, even destroying a police helicopter. Nightingale tells Sarah that Alan is responsible for all this, but she doesn't believe him. In all honesty, she's kind of insulting Alan, saying that he's just a geek writer, joking that he wears a tweed jacket and couldn't be capable of killing all of her deputies. Ouch. We can hear on another channel that the police have Rose and Barry in custody, saying that Barry seems to be drunk or possibly high, before pointing out that the FBI agent also smelt of alcohol. Another manuscript gives us insight into what Rose was thinking while being controlled during her meeting with Alan and Barry. It says that the dark presence made her fall into a dreamland, a world of black and grey. The old woman promised Rose that all of her wishes would come true and she would become Alan's muse. She was smiling so much it could hurt as she crushed the sleeping pills into the coffee. Deep down, however, she was screaming in terror. After a hell of a lot of running, Alan reaches the radio station of none other than Pat Main. We greet him as the FBI agent shows up outside. Pat tries to calm the situation, but Nightingale just starts throwing rounds out like he's a goddamn cowboy. The sheriff stops him in time from killing the damn local radio host as Alan is forced to once again hit the jets and get back into the woods towards the coal mine. We find a manuscript page that shows how Pat reacted to the close call to death, yelling at Nightingale, telling him he can't just start shooting off rounds like that. He never responded, instead just pushed away Pat's arm and marched away, burning with rage and humiliation. Alan gets a call from Alice as she tells him to help her and to cooperate. It's a very obvious fake call, with her words being scrambled around to form different sentences. We managed to find a car after fighting a possessed bulldozer. A crazy sentence to say out loud, but it did happen. Thankfully, the sun came up shortly after as morning began, allowing Alan to make good ground using the car to get to the coal mines in time for the meeting. We take a look around some surrounding buildings and can see another manuscript that explains the thoughts of Mott as Alan and Alice arrived on the ferry. Now, Mott, by the way, is the kidnapper's real name. If you weren't sure, it mentions that his first opinion of Alan was disappointment, especially since his boss made him out to be something special, but he wasn't really impressed. Mott got a good look at Alice though, and he liked what he saw. Mott fantasized about goading Alan into a fistfight, but wasn't able to do so. But he will get the chance. We finally reach the coal mines, which have been abandoned ever since 1970's volcanic eruption. The eruption caused much of the deep mining tunnels in the surrounding area to collapse. In fact, 32 miners lost their lives, and all the mining in Bright Falls came to a complete stop afterwards. Once inside the building, Alan had nothing to do but wait. Different scenarios of what could happen and what he could have done to Alice. But he never showed up. He calls Alan and says that there is now a new meeting point since something's come up for some reason. Alan is furious, but has no other choice than to get to the Mirror Peak meeting point. We have some backstory into the relationship of Thomas Zane and Barbara Jagger. For Zane, Jagger was beautiful, full of life. He had never been a happy man, and with no effort, she just changed that. For the first time in his life, he felt good. She was his muse. With her, the words always flowed, strong and sharp. Alan finds another television as he speaks on how ill he feels, that he managed to make his way downstairs and found a shoebox filled with books and papers by Thomas Zane. He was a poet, and a damn good one at that. He would write of muses and creators, summoning things from a magical lake using its power to shape the world. Under it was a world of gods, dreams, demons, and dark things that would wait for the chance to slip through, wearing the flesh of men as a disguise. Zane talks of he and his girlfriend being taken over by the dark presence, and how he grew scared of the lake. He believed it was a mirror to a void of darkness, where Lovecraftian presences live. Alan mentions that he's going to borrow these things for his story, and I must say, this whole story sounds pretty damn familiar to me. Another manuscript explains just how Mott found the Wakes. He checked all of Stucky's rental cabins, and he was a bit confused why they weren't there since they were supposed to be there. It was already dark when he found their car at Cauldron Lake. It didn't make any sense to him since there was no sign of them. They'd been there for hours. He looked down to the footbridge that once led to Diver's Isle before it sank, and he knew his boss would not be happy. We can hear Mott down in the woods below as he begins pleading with a woman, saying that his boss didn't know what he was dealing with, begging for mercy. He admits to the woman that he doesn't have Alan's wife, and doesn't know where she actually is, thinking that she probably drowned, but they pretended to kidnap her so he would hand over the manuscript. We find him kneeling as we get goddamn jump scared by Barbara. Unrelated to the story, but that scared the living crap out of me when it happened. Mott gets sent flying into the air, into the tornado, and so does Alan. Thankfully, Alan uses a nearby flare to save himself, but falls into the water below. As he sinks, he sees a vision of himself typing, Thomas Zane watching over him in the arms of somebody saving him. Alan awakes to Alice. Well, actually, it's Dr. Hartman. He tells Alan that he gave him a sedative and that he went through another rough period. He doesn't want Alan to have another episode, and explains that Alan is a patient at his clinic and has been here for a while. The shock of his wife's death has triggered a mental illness, before mentioning that Alan is suffering from symptoms of undifferentiated schizophrenia. Alan wakes up properly sometime later, and we can see a typewriter at his desk. Hartman checks to see if Alan is calm and asks Alan to come with him as he will reacquaint him with the clinic since Alan has most likely forgotten due to his current state. As a reminder, this is the same doctor that Alice intended Alan to see when they came to Bright Falls. He helps troubled artists, much like Alan. Hartman tells Alan that he needs to accept his wife's death in order to recover, telling him that she drowned, and that Alan just couldn't face it. He's suffering from hallucinations, paranoid delusions, unusual thinking, obsession with light and darkness. A sense that everything is about him, and his imagination has constructed an elaborate fantasy scenario in which his writings are affecting reality. It's just a coping mechanism to think that he still has control over his wife's fate. If you've ever seen Shutter Island, this will sound very, very familiar to you. We can see Cauldron Lake once again as Alan can see the area that Diver's Isle once stood, but now it's gone once again, just leaving waves in its wake. Hartman is proud of Alan, saying that right now we are in control, but each relapse makes it harder to bring him back to reality. But he puts his imagination as a writer to be the probable reason for this. Alan, of course, is trying his best not to believe it, even though the more Hartman spoke, the harder it was not to believe him. Hartman encourages Alan to continue writing, as it's a part of his therapy, and have placed a typewriter in his room for him to be able to work on. We also have some really strange characters that show up inside the clinic, but we find our two older friends from the diner earlier. This is Odin and Thor. They were a heavy metal band in the 70s and 80s called Old Gods of Asgard, and took on the names to complete the Viking image. We can see Thor putting Mjolnir to good use, as Hartman tells Alan that both of these guys are suffering from dementia due to their older rock and roll lifestyle. Once again, encouraged to get writing when we have a chance. I must say, by the way, I love these two. They joke around with Alan, but address him again as Thomas Zane, possibly pointing towards Thomas Zane being a fake persona that Alan was taking during his episodes. Not to mention, they're playing the Night Springs board game. Night Springs is the television show that Alan was seeing when going around Bright Falls, possibly his subconscious incorporating that into his fake reality. The brothers tell Alan to go to the Anderson farm, it's their old farm in fact, to find the message and to give a note to Alan. It's another manuscript page describing how Zane could feel his poems taking form, imagining the power surging through the keys of the typewriter. He was scared of it, but thanks to his assistant Emil, he convinced Zane to keep going since Emil also had a way with words. We continue the conversation with the Anderson brothers as they joke that Alan's leather on his jacket is not very rock and roll. Odin points out that the Baba Yaga got to Thomas. By Thomas he meant Alan. Thor says that the witch is taken from all of them, taking his thunder and even Odin's ravens. They say that this lake gives you powers. If you're a creator or an artist, you're practically a god here, saying that the witch makes sure that this power comes out twisted and wrong, and tells Alan to ask the lamp lady, since she knows what happened to the other rider. Thor berates Alan, saying that the witch controls him and that Alan has been letting her, opening the door for her. Odin chimes in saying that the door was already open a crack. This is a reference to the manuscript page that we found earlier that explains that the poet, Thomas Zane, awoke the darkness before putting it back to its home. The rock stars stirred the darkness a bit, meaning the Anderson brothers, but not enough. Plus, of course, the poet was there to be able to make sure the darkness didn't come out again. But then the rider, meaning Alan Wake, woke it up completely. We find another television that has Alan on the screen. He mentions how he has been trapped in the cabin for days and that he isn't himself. There is a shadow in his head, mentioning that his editor, the woman in black, is not human. Or it's not human. A dark presence wearing an old woman's face, and that there's a hole in her chest where her heart should be. Alan feels like he's made a terrible mistake. He's no closer to saving Alice. The woman has been lying to him, using him to create a story that it wants, and that story is coming true. We return to our room and Alan sits down to write. He isn't able to. His hands are shaking uncontrollably. We hear some chaos going out in the lobby and we go to check it out. It turns out that Thor got his hands on a real hammer and gave one of the orderlies a good whack over the head. We take the key from the orderly and head to Hartman's office and can find a bunch of recordings that Hartman has made with his patients. Interestingly, Alice was one of these recordings. We can hear Alice telling Hartman about Alan's problems. that he is angry all the time, he doesn't sleep and cannot work. He'll just sit there for hours frustrated, and Alice is feeling like she can't even speak with him anymore. That she doesn't know or even like this new version of Alan. She is scared that she is going to lose him since he is so deep in his own problems and unwilling to open up to her. She hopes that Hartman can help him. After listening to the recording, it's obvious that this is the recording that was cut up and rearranged during Alan's earlier phone call with the kidnapper. We can find other recordings also that reveal that both Nightingale attempted to enter the clinic in search of Alan Wake but was denied entry, and even that Barry came looking for Alan but was threatened by the orderly for asking questions. We find another manuscript showing Mott telling Hartman the news of how he couldn't get the full manuscript from Alan, and the anger that Hartman had towards Mott for failing. In fact, there's a big old photo on the wall outside the office. Firstly, I don't think I've ever seen a photograph this big before, but Mott can be seen standing next to Hartman, showing that he was working at the Hartman clinic. It explains how the kidnapper had the audio file to fake a call to Alan, and when Mott referred to his boss in previous manuscripts, he was actually talking about Hartman the whole time. Alan was getting played. We can hear Barry in the next room over as he has been locked into Hartman's office, along with Alan Wake's cardboard cutout. Barry explains that he was found by the police in Rose's trailer, but they didn't hassle him all that much, since he threatened to sue them all if they didn't realise he was the victim. Nightingale, however, did give him a bit of a hard time, big surprise, but he does go on to say that Hartman called him telling him that Alan was at the clinic and to come pick Alan up. However, when he got here, 2 people clobbered him and put him in the room, and he of course stole the cutout to get back at Rose for what she did for us at the trailer. We find all of our manuscript pages on Hartman's desk as Hartman himself finds us. Alan pulls a gun on him, and Hartman admits to making up the whole mental breakdown thing. Hartman pleads with Alan to continue working together, since only together can they create something truly wonderful. Our old friend the Darkness comes back to meet us, and we lock Hartman in the room with it, not ending up too well for our favourite doctor. We find a manuscript that gives us more insight to what happened after Alan fell into the water after the whole tornado incident with Mott. Hartman was watching it unfold through binoculars and had Jack paddle out to get him. For Hartman, this was perfect. Alan Wake was now within his reach. Also, another big reveal was that Hartman's first name is actually Emil, the same name used to describe Thomas Zane's assistant all those years ago, meaning that Hartman was actually aware of the events that took place on Diver's Isle with Zane and Jagger, not to mention the goings-ons at Cauldron Lake. Alan narrowly avoids the darkness inside and outside the clinic, and they both get into a car and head out of there. Barry wants to leave Bright Falls for good, but Alan tells him that they need to go to Anderson Farm to follow up on some leads. Barry reluctantly agrees, but tells Alan that he owes him one hell of a tanning bed after this, since he's done with this darkness thing for the rest of his life. Alan believes that Alice is still alive beneath the lake, that she was taken by the darkness and is not dead, since there is something special about the lake, doing something to the works of art that is created there, making it come true. But the catch is that the dark presence that twists it to its own ends. That is why his manuscript is taking over reality, so the darkness can take over everything. It happened to Thomas Zane. It happened to the Anderson brothers. In fact, the Anderson brothers knew about it, but were far too gone on the drugs that Hartman has been giving them, instead leading him to a message at their farm. A boulder falls and hits the car, causing Barry and Alan to end up down the hill. Somehow both of them are alive but separated. They tell each other to meet at the farm since they were at different elevations. After some running, Alan can see the farm and a car heading away. He believes that this could be Barry, probably caught up in some trouble down at the farm as he heads to meet up with him down the hill. We find another manuscript page that explains how the dark presence is growing stronger and stronger thanks to the heavily edited manuscript. It was editing Wake's work to make itself more powerful, and once it reached the manuscript's end, it would finally be free. We find the car outside the cabin and look inside when we hear some screaming from upstairs. When we find the person screaming, it's not Barry, but the guy that we saved from the jail earlier, and it turns out that this is Walt from the radio that we heard earlier as well. He speaks about his best friend Danny, saying that something is very wrong with Danny and that he was just being attacked by him. He ends up dying and we find another television in the house. Alan speaks how the story that the dark presence wants him to write won't save Alice, In fact, it's a horror story that will end up killing Alice, himself, and the whole town, possibly even the world. Alan decides to write himself into the story as the main protagonist. With this comes a very big risk, but it's the only way to save Alice. He will be bound to the script just like everybody else, and the story must stay true to its nature for it to work. There must be victims, near escapes, cliffhangers. It can't be certain that the hero will succeed in a horror story. He has to almost die, but he will write his own escape into that story. He needs help, and he decides that Zane will be the one to help him. We kill Danny and take the car down to the Andersons' farm. We find Barry on the Andersons' stage, which saves him when all the old electronics turn on. Barry is very happy to be reunited. We find another manuscript in the Andersons' barn house. It mentions how in 1976, madness reigned at the farm. See, the Andersons absolutely loved moonshine, and one of their ingredients that they used for their homemade moonshine was unfiltered water from Cauldron Lake. It makes them feel like gods. Odin couldn't stop laughing and even thought about cutting his eye out, while Thor was running around the fields naked with a hammer in his hand, trying to catch lightning from the sky. Their songs had power, real power. Something ancient is stirring in the depths. We head into their home and turn on the radio. It plays a song made and sung by the Andersons called The Lady of the Light. The lyrics explain how to find the Lady of the Night who has gone mad by the night. Barry and Ellen conclude this is referring to the lamp lady, Cynthia Weaver. The lyrics turn out to be the full message. Ellen and Barry decide to head out at first light and to get drunk off the Andersons' moonshine in the meantime. This leads to Ellen falling asleep and ending up in a dream again. It goes back to the moment during the first night at Bright Falls. Ellen recounts the memories of what happened thanks to the Andersons' moonshine. We can see the moment Alice fell into the water and Ellen jumping in after her. The final point of his memory before everything went dark and he woke up behind the wheel of his car after the accident. Ellen couldn't find her in the water and swam to the dock. Barbara Jagger manipulated Ellen, telling him that Alice is inside the house, that she wasn't dead after all. The darkness had made Ellen her puppet, baiting him into the study and whispering to him falsehoods of how she was upstairs and that he could just simply apologize to her. Once in the study, she tells him that she drowned in the water and that it's all his fault, and that he's the one that was guilty for it. She tells him that the Cauldron Lake is special and that he can still save Alice. He just needs to write, and that she will guide him on what to do. Alan is now completely under the darkness's control. For a week, he wrote a complete manuscript entitled Departure. Jagger was his editor, whispering into his ear, making sure the darkness grew stronger and stronger. Even with the cobwebs in his head, he was aware enough to put his own escape into the narrative, bringing light into the cabin to release him before he could finish the final pages. The ending, where the darkness consumed everything and everybody. He wrote Zane into the story and allowed his light to be enough to set him free from the cabin. Zane arrived, dressed in his diver's suit, telling Alan that the darkness will sense his presence and will come back soon, urging Alan to leave. Zane reflects that it stole the skin of his love, Barbara, saying how old she now looks. Do you remember at the very beginning, during the dream that Alan Wake had? Firstly, we know that Zane was the light that guided him and helped him, but the picture on the wall, aka the diver's suit that I told you to think about or remember, it was Zane all along. It was pointing to his presence, even all the way back then. Zane grabbed the manuscript pages as Alan fled the cabin, and the darkness fought with Zane. Alan pointed out that the act that he had just written for Zane must have sent Zane further into the depths of darkness that he now haunted, but he managed to weaken the presence, keeping Alan safe that one night. Alan awakes to a gun in his face. It's Nightingale. While Alan is in the jail cell, he sees Cynthia Weaver, speaking to herself that somebody will come for something when the time is right, since Thomas said so himself. That is her job after all, to keep it safe within the light. Both Barry and Alan are hungover and really can't be bothered to be in jail at the same time. We can hear Sarah and Nightingale arguing about the arrest of Alan, as Nightingale mentions that he has all the evidence he needs in Alan's manuscripts. Conspiracy to murder a federal agent included. He's done for. The lights begin to flicker as Alan is having a vision back to his missing wife. Sarah checks on him, but Nightingale is convinced it's just a ploy from Alan for sympathy. Sarah believes Alan and pushes back against Nightingale, saying that his words would mean more to her if he was actually sober and believed that he was actually on official business. Nightingale pulls a gun and tells Alan that he is only leaving over his dead body, before he has a realization. He has read this before in the manuscript. The darkness pulls him out of the door and Sarah is completely dumbfounded. Alan mentions to her that we need light and we head to her office. We tell her that we need to find Cynthia Weaver to deal with the whole darkness problem, and she says that Cynthia is living in the decommissioned power plant and would be able to get Alan there quickly using a helicopter. We head out with Sarah while Barry notifies a bunch of contacts that Sarah gives him, including Pat Main and her father, Frank Breaker. She tells Barry to tell them the code word, Night Springs, and that they'll know what it's about. This particular moment here is the preface for one of the Alan Wake comic books that we'll be discussing later in the video, so remember this moment. A manuscript can be found while Sarah and Alan journey to find the helicopter keys in the town hall. It mentions how the darkness that is currently wearing the face of Barbara Jagger is furious. The light set the rider free, weakening it, but it would take a few days for it to recover. It would prove a difficult task to recapture the rider once again. We find the keys and meet back up with Barry as we head to the helicopter. He's equipped himself thoroughly with a headlight and some Christmas lights that he thinks will act like garlic to a vampire. Another manuscript mentions how Alice has been while trapped in the darkness. She screamed until she could scream no longer. The darkness around her was alive and malevolent. She couldn't get out. Her terror would have destroyed her mind if not for her sensing Alan in the dark. She could see the words he was writing as flickering shadows. Alan sensed her also and was trying to work his way to her. We reach the helipad as the darkness makes a desperate attempt to stop them from leaving. We get the best of them and take off. Sarah mentions to Alan during the ride that she's actually quite familiar with his writing. In fact, she believes her father is a lot like Alex Casey, the main character of Alan's book series. We attempt to land the helicopter, but the Ravens stop that as Alan falls from that helicopter. Thankfully, not very far from the ground. Sarah and Barry attempt to shake the birds while Alan is left to get to the power plant on foot. We do manage to get to the power plant and meet Cynthia Weaver. She is untrusting at first, but when Alan mentions Thomas Zane and the song from the Anderson Brothers, and that what he is looking for is in the well-lit room, a room that Cynthia built within the dam to safeguard it from the darkness. We also find out that Cynthia was the person writing the tips and leaving the secret caches found around Bright Falls to help Alan and others fight against the darkness. Alan mentions to her if we are ready to head outside, and Cynthia berates him that he's breaking the only rule: you never go outside. She has a secret passage to get to the well-lit room. It's an old water pipe. We come to find out that Cynthia knew Thomas and Barbara. In fact, she had a huge crush on Tom, saying that she was even a little glad when Barbara had the accident. She talks about the moment when Tom started writing, trying to bring Barbara back, but he didn't realize you can't do that. There is no such thing as a free ride. See, the darkness might look like Barbara, but it wasn't her. Barbara was sweet, and Tom didn't realize until it was too late. He tried to undo it and wrote himself, Barbara, and everything that he has ever written about out of the world, completely erasing himself from history. Prior to this, Thomas Zane was incredibly famous, but afterwards, nobody knew him anymore. The only thing he left behind he gave to Cynthia as insurance. Cynthia is unsure if Thomas trusted her or just used her due to him knowing about Cynthia's true feelings towards him, but regardless, he knew that she wouldn't refuse him. Cynthia reiterates that all they are now are characters written in a story by Alan, and that nobody will survive until the darkness is stopped, since she will only twist the story to her own end. Alan asks Cynthia how she knows all of this, and she replies that Thomas Zane told her that he wrote it that way. She still sees him on the television from beyond and below speaking to her, much like Alan Wake saw himself on the television. As Alan and Cynthia head towards the well-lit room, Alan calls Barry to inform him to where to meet. We hear a scream and an explosion outside. Cynthia says they're probably dead and that we don't have much time for this. Alan doesn't listen and leaves the pipe to find his friend. Cynthia is angry about this, thinking Alan is foolish for putting everybody at risk for a lost cause, but tells him to meet her at the dam if he somehow survives. A manuscript in the woods describes the chopper crash. Turns out, A bunch of birds flew into the rotor, causing it to crash, and that was what we heard on the phone. We find the wreck, but we don't see any signs of bodies. Quite honestly, how the heck anyone could have walked out alive and without injuries is a mystery to me, but we do find Barry and Sarah unarmed fighting Taken. We get to the dam, but due to some faulty wiring and the help of the darkness, Alan once again gets separated from Alan and Sarah. Another manuscript gives insight into Zane's decision to erase himself, feeling that he was solely responsible for the horror. If he erased himself, it would banish the darkness alongside him. But he was concerned that one day it would resurface, so even as he wrote himself and his work out of existence, he added a loophole as insurance, an exception to the rule. Anything of his that's stored within a shoebox would remain. The darkness does everything it can to get Alan on the dam, but Alan narrowly gets inside with Barry, Sarah, and Cynthia. She reassures Alan that she looked after the well-lit room for many years, and there isn't even a shadow within it. The power is fail-safe, and the bulbs are numbered and regularly changed based on their make and model. She leads us to a vault that contains a shoebox. Inside is a manuscript that is autobiographical. In fact, it's a memory of Alan Wake's childhood, but it was not written by Alan. It was written by Thomas Zane. None of these pages were supposed to even exist anymore. It spoke of Alan's childhood, how he would fight back against sleep and would deal with constant nightmares. So one evening, his mother sat by his bed and gave him an old light switch. She called it the clicker, and by flicking the switch, it would turn on a magical light that would drive away the nightmares. And to imbue the clicker with all possible power, she added that it was given to her by Alan's father. Since Alan never knew of his father, anything of his took on a mythical proportions in his mind. And with the clicker in his hand, Alan slept like a baby, and remembers this 30 years later as he stood on the rim of Cauldron Lake, and with that he took a deep breath and jumped. Alan is amazed. He gave the clicker to Alice, yet here it was the whole time. Zane wrote it into existence in a story that Alan had written. Using the clicker, he could save Alice. We see Alan 2 years previous as he is dealing with a headache and a massive hangover. We can see a television interview that Alan had done days prior as he speaks about his decision to end his Alex Casey book series. Alan felt that Casey was a gloomy guy to spend all your working hours with and wanted to explore new things, so he decided to kill Casey off. He mentions how his new book will be called Departure and that he looks forward to beginning writing it. Alice arrives home as Alan is in a really bad mood. We get a little bit of a glimpse of what Alan was talking about in her Hartman interview. Alan owns up to his attitude and mentions how maybe a vacation could do them both some good, since he just needs some peace and quiet. We get back to present time as Alan tells Sarah and Barry that he needs to do this last part himself, that he needs to finish writing the final page of the book. Barry asks why Alan can't just write the final page here in the well-lit room, but Alan mentions that the final page is still in the typewriter and he needs to read what's on it first. Since he can't cut corners, Zane attempted to do just that and it didn't end well for him. Barry, Sarah and Cynthia will stay in the well-lit room in order to stay safe as Barry farewells his friend and wishes him luck. Outside, the sun was out. Alan was wondering if his pressing of the clicker caused the daylight to begin again, but didn't wait long enough to question it. He needed to get to Cauldron Lake. Along the way, we find a motel. Inside one of the rooms was actually the motel room that Agent Nightingale was using while he was staying in Bright Falls in search of Alan Wake. It included a bunch of photos of all the people of the town. This location plays a very important role in the Alan Wake Files book that we'll be discussing later in the video, so keep that in mind. We find a few manuscripts on our journey to Cauldron Lake. Firstly, a page that describes the amount of things at the bottom of the lake. In fact, the things that we've been finding around Bright Falls that makes no sense, like the aeroplane in the woods or the boat at the trailer home. Both of these things were wreckages that were at the bottom of Cauldron Lake at one time, that the darkness has now thrown out while chasing Alan. Another manuscript page describes how Thomas tried to cut the heart out of the darkness while it wore Barbara's face. His love was speaking sweet nothings, sugar laced with poison. Zane put on his suit and untied the monster from the chair. The darkness thrashed weakly after Zane's erasure of history. He jumped off the pier into the dark water with Barbara, descending towards a bottom that never came. Now, while Alan is journeying towards the lake, I want to mention the reveal that we had about Zane writing the clicker story into Alan's life. This poses a few questions. How did Thomas Zane know of Alan Wake, since Alan wasn't born when Thomas died in 1970? This poses the real possibility that Thomas Zane created Alan Wake, using his writing, powered by Cauldron Lake. And it also adds to the reason why Alan never had a father, since he was possibly not conceived normally, instead conceived by the magic of the lake due to Thomas Zane's writing. Regardless, more on that later. Once Alan gets to the lake, things get really weird, as the darkness uses everything in its power to stop Alan from being able to reach Diver's Isle. Alan does manage to stop the darkness for the time being, giving him enough time to look down into Cauldron Lake and to live out the prophetic sentence he read in Thomas Zane's manuscript page. He held onto the clicker, took a deep breath and jumped. Alan awakes to Alice, saying that he was just having a bad dream and that everything is fine. Alan freaks out and says that it wasn't a dream. Alice tells him that the power's out and just to go back to bed and she'll help him forget about his fear of the dark. Alan corrects her that actually in fact it's Alice that has the fear of the dark, not him, before realizing that she isn't afraid of the dark at all and that means that it isn't his wife. Alice's voice turns into Barbara's as she asks Tom to come back to bed instead of Alan, but once he finds the clicker, she's dealt with. Thomas Zane just floats his ass into the house as he tells Alan to find a way to the cabin, as the darkness won't let him pass. He tells Alan that its heart is filled with darkness and that he needs to fill its heart with light. An evil-looking Alan appears as Thomas tells Alan not to worry about him. His name is Mr. Scratch, and he'll meet his friends when Alan is gone. Alan is now inside the darkness, as words revealed by light will manifest, similar to how Alice described her time down here that we found in the manuscript earlier. Alan begins hearing memories about Alice trying to leave him, saying that she found somebody else, and another memory of Alan deliberately turning off the lights in order to scare Alice, showing him as almost abusive. Alan points out that these memories were not true, that nothing like this has ever happened. The darkness was trying to get into his head. This was mixed in with memories of Thomas Zane as he knew the darkness was not Barbara. She begged him to untie her and that she would help him write his masterpiece. Tom reiterates that she isn't his Barbara, and he grabs a knife, saying that he'll cut the darkness out of her heart. Barbara begins to scream. We enter the cabin as we can see Barbara standing there, telling Alan that he will never save Alice and that she is much older than him and more cunning. It will simply find another face to wear, and someone else will eventually dream it back to freedom, just like the Andersons and Alan did. Alan puts his hand into the hole of her chest before using the clicker, putting light into her heart just as Thomas said. The darkness disappears as Alan went up to the writing room. He's now finally understood how to write the ending to Departure, saying that there is both light and darkness, guilt and atonement. But no matter what, the scales need balance, and everything comes at a price. This is where Zane went wrong. We can see once again the moment that Alice fell, as Alan jumped in after her, and Barbara dragged her down to the depths. However, she now awoke, swimming for her life towards the surface of the lake. She makes landfall and notices how Diver's Isle is now gone. She calls out for Alan, but he is nowhere to be found. Morning sets in for Bright Falls as we get a glimpse of the town as Deerfest has now begun. The town is celebrating their favoured tradition. We can see Rose holding a lantern as Nightingale watches from the window behind her in the darkness. Rose holding the lantern is a nice touch, as she is Alan's equivalent to Cynthia for Zane. Both of them have crushes on their respective writers and would do anything for them. We can see Alan finish the book as he finishes with a single line. It isn't a lake, it's an ocean. Thus ends the base game of Alan Wake 1. Firstly, if you're still watching, thank you very much, and I hope that you've enjoyed the video thus far. If you've made it here, put Big Barry in the comments so I can see, and I always read every single comment on the video, so feel free to give me your theories or opinions on the game. However, we're not done yet. The base game of Alan Wake has 2 DLCs that we will need to cover, and we'll still be getting into all the other stuff that we can find that gives us info of events that take place before Alan Wake 2. So, let's get into those 2 DLCs. The first is called The Signal. Alan recounts finishing Departure, as he has mixed feelings about his decisions, saying that it's about time he opens the door and allows the light to come in. He is back in Bright Falls, but it's different somehow. Something's wrong. The diner he once entered felt almost dreamlike, and the people within spoke differently, distorted almost. Alan could feel something waiting for him down the hallway at the diner, just like before. This time he could enter the bathroom as he could see something within the mirror. Within that mirror was Thomas Zane, who spoke to Alan, telling him to go no deeper. Alan is losing himself and Thomas is doing everything that he can, but ultimately it's up to Alan. He needs Alan to find a better point of contact. He tells Alan that he himself is the one making this happen and shows us a glimpse of what is happening. We can see Alan in the mirror going crazy as he narrates the story taking place. Alan realizes that he's within the dark place. He begins to understand that something went wrong after he finished Departure. Inside the diner, televisions appear with Alan's eye, just like the television at the start of Alan Wake 1 within his dream. Again, he is explaining a narrative, but it's almost evil, like Alan is working against himself. We get out and find a nearby house. Inside is a manuscript page that is jumbled with words. Nothing makes sense, but it allowed Alan to use those words to manifest items for him to use, such as this phone. Thomas calls him on the phone, telling Alan that he is continuing to drift deeper and is struggling to reach him. He needs to come to Thomas and tells Alan to use the words to guide him. Alan shows up again on the television, explaining frantically a narrative of cars coming alive trying to kill Alan, once again working against himself. The dark place is playing tricks on Alan, and Thomas is doing everything that he can to guide him to safety. Nothing in the dark place made sense, but Zane began leaving manuscript pages filled with words, including ones that are creating a fake version of Barry, one of Alan's friends, to help guide him to where he needs to go. Barry tells Alan that he simply needs to listen to Zane, since he's been here for decades and is practically an expert at this place. Alan continues to create narratives on the television to halt himself, slow himself down. This version of himself was insane. Like a demented storyteller who wanted nothing else than to torment and destroy his own protagonist. The dark place is weird due to it pulling from the mind of the creator. It's Alan's own imagination that is making this place so unusual. Something Barry points out to Alan, that imagination is sort of the enemy here. Alan knows that he saved Alice, but he wasn't sure when it happened. How long has he been in this place? Days, weeks, longer maybe? He had no way of knowing. He could only hope that Alice was okay, since he didn't know what happened to her after she left the dark place. Alan begins to see memories of his past, including one that he mentions took place when he felt like a real writer, instead of the fraud he feels like today. We get back inside his home as Thomas Zane is there waiting. He mentions that Alan did well to find this place as it's much calmer. They need to talk, but only have a little bit of time. Thomas shows Alan himself on the television again, telling Alan that this is him currently in reality, even as they speak. Alan tells Thomas that that isn't him on the television and that the darkness is just twisting it or making a hallucination. Thomas reveals to Alan that the dark presence is not responsible for what is happening at all. Alan himself is making this happen. He is trapped in his own nightmares. He is fighting himself. The real Alan was going insane, doing everything he could to destroy a part of himself within the nightmare. He banishes Zane using his narrative, and Alan is once again having to fight for his life. He would have to destroy the televisions, find a way to fight back against himself. When he destroys enough of them, he collapses and awakes in Hartman's lodge once again. Simply another layer of the nightmare. We can see the real Alan Wake as he lies on the floor of the cabin, yelling to himself about his own delusions, surrounded by manuscript pages. The second DLC is called The Rider. It takes us right back to the moment of Alan's delusions. Hartman turns into Barry, as his friend attempts to realign Alan with reality, mentioning that he knows that this is a dream and nothing is as it seems here. This brings Alan back to a more sane mindset as he can feel time running out. He needs to get himself out of this nightmare or this will only get worse. He mentions that after he finished Departure, he felt finished himself. All he wanted was to save Alice, and now a part of him just wanted to give in and die. But he couldn't give up. Thomas reached him and kept him from falling too deep within his own mind. He was going to fight his way out. We can see Thomas's light as Barry tells Alan that he is done sinking, and that he's almost caught up to Zane. Alan is left to continue fighting against himself in a pretty crazy fireworks show kind of way. We make our way to Zane as our fake imaginary version of Barry bids us farewell, since he was just a crutch made by Thomas to help Alan find his way. But now that Thomas is here, he doesn't really have much purpose anymore. Thomas congratulates Alan, telling him that he is in his own dream, and to wake himself up, he must first reach himself in the cabin. The way to reach the cabin is within the lighthouse, just like Alan's dream at the beginning. Thomas mentions that once Alan gets to the lighthouse, he'll be on his own. Thomas cannot enter the cabin now, since the darkness made sure of that in the last encounter. The only one that can save Alan is himself. Thomas can't do anymore. Alan ends up in a maze of his own memories, a hamster wheel of sorts, constantly moving, attempting to keep him locked in. Alan gets out and Thomas encourages him, telling Alan that this place is a twisted and vast place, home to forces and beings that are completely alien, including the Dark Presence. Alan asks Thomas how to get out of this place, to which Thomas says that you can sometimes send transmissions between the worlds, but to actually leave the place is something that Thomas has never found a way to do. He goes on to explain that the world he is seeing is created purely from the imagination of his true self in the cabin, using the dark place, and is now in the process of going insane. The version of Alan that we see is only a part of Alan Wake's true personality. This time, the version of Alan that is capable of rational thought and planning, which is why Thomas is speaking to him particularly. If this part of Alan can regain control, then he has a chance of making it. But a part of Alan wants to give in, drift away into oblivion. This Alan represents the part that isn't ready to quit and die. Alan is obviously quite taken aback by being told that his version of himself is actually not really real, and that currently within the dark place there are currently two versions of himself. He questions if Mr. Scratch is also a version of him, to which Thomas tells him that he isn't. Alan gets angry at Thomas, accusing him of playing a game. Thomas tells Alan that he is not the author of Alan's story. Alan mentions the manuscript in the shoebox, how Thomas wrote about the clicker and gave it to Cynthia Weaver to guard it. A sort of weird moment happens as Thomas admits to writing the page saying that Alan needed the clicker and that Cynthia was needed, but he seems almost unsure of himself. He just tells Alan to keep going before disappearing and stops speaking to Alan for a moment. He does show up again shortly after to help create a path for Alan using a tree. Alan asks Thomas how he does these things, and Thomas mentions that it's like lucid dreaming and having control. They have a conversation about Thomas being in Alan's dream at the very beginning, saying that he taught Alan what he needed to know to survive and to fix the mistake that Thomas made with Barbara all those years ago. We find a false memory of a meeting between the television version of Alan and a dream version of Dr. Hartman. Hartman points out a bunch of medical diagnoses that he believes Alan to be suffering with, and essentially is trying to point out that Alice, and quite frankly the world, is better off without Alan. The television version of Alan is agreeing with everything being said as a ploy to make the dream version of Alan to give up and surrender. He uses a fake recording of Alice, of her telling Alan that she hates him and how Alan gave up on her when the darkness took her, saying that if he didn't have the hissy fit in the cabin, then she would have never been taken in the first place. The only thing that keeps her happy since she got out of the darkness is knowing that she'll never have to see Alan ever again. The dream version of Alan recognizes that nothing he saw was true, that he succeeded in saving Alice and there is no way that she could feel that way about him. Thomas congratulates him for realizing the fantasies, but mentions how the version of him bent on self-destruction is not aware of these fantasies, and Alan needs to take back control and quickly. Thomas explains that he can go no further, and he gives a final manuscript page to Alan containing a memory. The memory is a real one, of Alice, as she speaks to Alan during a moment that he felt worthless and doubted if Alice truly loved him or not, or if he even deserved her love. She reassures him that his way of thinking is just in his head, that she loves him dearly and she isn't going anywhere. Alan reaches the lighthouse as he begins to reflect on what the Dark Presence could have done to Thomas to not allow him to be able to follow. At the top of the lighthouse was a passage back to the Diver's Isle. Alan's imagination has a final attempt to destroy himself, sending Barry and others to stop him outside. But Alan gets the best of them. He enters the house and goes upstairs where he finds himself on the ground, touching him and merging together once again. Just like that, Alan could think clearly again. Alan realized that he can't survive in this place the same way Thomas could, and he might not make it back to himself a second time if he was to lose control again. He would need to use the typewriter again, trying to achieve the impossible to get out of here. He writes the first page of his sequel to Departure, a book called Return. And with that wraps up the 2 DLC and all of the actual video game aspects of Alan Wake 1. Now, I'm going to get into the Alan Wake Files book and what can be found within it. I will be summarizing everything down as much as I can, but I don't want to avoid crucial details. But due to some weird things about showing the book's pages on the video on YouTube, I'll just be showing segments of gameplay from the game while I talk over the books. So imagine this like an audiobook of sorts, I don't know. Let's just get into it. The preface of the book speaks from the perspective of a man named Clay Stewart. This is the guy within Alan Wake's dream at the beginning of the game. He speaks how if somebody had asked him only 2 years ago if he knew who Alan Wake was or where Bright Falls was, he would be stumped up to that point. His life was untouched by these particulars. He writes this book in hopes of gaining some measure of forgiveness from those he hurt along the way. See, he lived in Wisconsin, a quiet life all around, until he started having dreams, reoccurring dreams that all pointed him towards a particular place. He recalls his first dream. Nothing at all really. He was in a cabin in the woods. Somebody knocked and he stepped onto the porch. Nobody's there, but the lantern is broken. The second dream is much the same, except after the lantern, he sees movement from the woods. He follows it to the forest edge, but then it stops. The third dream follows the same course, but the sounds get louder, trees begin to fall, and he's caught in a storm. He runs down the road until he reaches the ocean. He sees a lighthouse, and in his dream's logic, that lighthouse will keep him safe. A man holds open the door to the lighthouse, waving him inwards. He runs frantically, chased by the dark presence, and in the last possible moment, he is consumed. He ceases to exist. Soon enough, he has these dreams every night, ending the same way. Sometimes he saves his life, and other times he saves the other man's life. But no matter what, they both die in the end. He began to avoid sleeping, staying up later and later. And one night, while his wife and children were asleep in bed, he sat watching the television before falling asleep by accident. He describes hearing the voice of the man from his dreams talking to him, describing his writing technique and how he just wants a good story. He awakes to notice that on the television, the man from his dreams was on the television set, being interviewed at a wooden table by 2 men. He watches in awe and sees the caption on the screen, Alan Wake, author of The Sudden Stop. He begins to rationalize his dreams, thinking that since Alan Wake was famous, maybe he saw his face somewhere and subconsciously put it into his dreams. But he knew things about this man from his dreams, things that he shouldn't know. He obsessively researched all of Wake's writing. The more he read, the more sure he was that Alan was the same man trapped in these hellish nightmares. He believed that he had a shared experience with Alan Wake. He felt it was a warning. Stewart wrote to Wake's publishers and gave them a letter, but only received a note encouraging him to buy Wake's next book. Every time he re-entered the dream, he was an observer of this strange dimension where dark forces roamed looking to kill him. He transcribed every detail that he could of these nightmares, updating a dream journal that he started. He grew further apart from his wife as a result. The dreams became more horrific over the next few months, and Stewart only knew one thing. Alan Wake was at the center of what he was experiencing. In fact, he was the cause of it all. Every night he was killed, or witnessed others being killed. He saw a small town consumed by darkness, and it was all Alan Wake's fault. Stewart didn't blame him for it though, but he needed to warn Wake of it. He began researching lighthouses and stumbled upon the lighthouse in his dreams within a university library. It was located outside a town called Bright Falls. A quick internet search and he saw the town from his dreams, the same ones consumed by the darkness. He bought a bus ticket immediately and arrived in the town only 2 days later. He didn't like the feeling of the town, something seemed off. There was bullet holes in the buildings and talks of tornadoes and a number of women dressed in mourning clothes. There were 3 funerals in his first day in Bright Falls, all held for local fathers, husbands and wives. He asked the people what happened, and they spoke of horrible accidents and freak storms, an annual town party that was preceded by horrible events. He talks about the look of the locals' faces, recalling the events. He described it almost like survivor's guilt, and strangely, it seemed as if the local population were being kept hostage somehow. They grew cagey of Stewart, like they were being watched or recorded, almost as if they continued talking, more deaths would plague the town. Stewart checked into room number 2 of the Majestic Motel. He describes it as smelling of alcohol and cigarettes. He had no idea how long he would stay here, but he unpacked his bags and put his dream journal up into the air vent, just like he saw in the movies. However, he must not have been the first to have this thought, since inside the air vent was a green cardboard box, filled with documents, some 3 thick manila folders thick. The author was a special agent Robert Nightingale of the FBI. Stewart realized that all this time, the months of suffering, his failing marriage, and the confusion that brought him to this moment, it brought him here to this specific room in Bright Falls. Within the notes, he found out that Alan Wake has also been in Bright Falls, and that his wife Alice had disappeared. A series of chaotic and unexplained events led to missing and dead people within the town, destructions of buildings, and reports of shadow men and monsters. Stewart goes over Nightingale's field notes while he stays in Bright Falls. I will narrate them all in their entirety for you just to make it easier to understand. They are as followed. Day 1, night. Exhausted. Missed the turnoff. Took 2 hours longer than planned. Trees are pretty, but hell, they all look alike. This place really is in the middle of nowhere, and not in the exact middle, that would be too easy. Sun's already down, motel stinks, and not even in the good Chicago way. Majestic my ass. Got to check in with the local Johnny Law in the morning. Haven't really grilled the local yokels yet. Don't think the moron at the front desk counts. Wish I had the Bureau's backing. Some official resources would help, but then there'd be a lot of explaining to do. And I've got no better way to burn my free time. Since still a few favors I can call in if I need some heavy lifting, but it's better this way. Day 2. Johnny Law turns out to be Jenny Law. Sheriff Breaker comes from a cop family. Knows diddly squat. Usual hostility to feds. Don't know whether to use honey or salt on this one. Don't have enough honey on me. She did make the phone call I needed, so let's consider her pliable. Diners are a great way to get all friendly with the townies. They had a cardboard cutout of Wake propped up near the door. One of the waitresses is supposed to be a big fan. Stewart looked into this and spoke with Sheriff Breaker himself. She had a different view than Nightingale, saying that she believed their relationship to be more cordial, and that the hostility mentioned could be the agent's predisposition. She wouldn't give detail on the phone call nor the current whereabouts of Agent Nightingale. Day 2, afternoon. How to get our boy before he hurts anyone? That's the $1 million question. Do these people know what they're dealing with here? Good God, it's like watching toddlers play with nitro. Suspect there's something behind all those dopey country facades. Everyone knows more than they're telling, or maybe they don't, which is even scarier. Wake did a number on that waitress, sweet kid, but she can't tell night from day. Stewart finds Nightingale's suspicion of Wake strange, since he is not associated with anything that should give an FBI agent reason for concern. Day 3. Noises last night, some damn animals, went out again, got lost again. Goddamn trees. Can't believe how slippery some guys are. Talked to the front desk moron this morning. Didn't seem to know zip about Wake. Got real quiet when I mentioned him, in fact. Could be they just ran out of thoughts. I'm getting nothing out of these people. Day 3. Night. Scanner picked up confused distress call response. Domestic violence, or burglary, or vandalism, or kidnapping. Deputy Dog can't decide. Little Jenny's Law's got her hands full. Things here are just strange enough that I'm sure I'm on the right track. Found Wake's agent, followed him a bit. Tubby tried to lose me, but maybe Wake's so slippery because his buddy's so slimy. Stewart points out that Nightingale's entries regarding the scanner audio are interesting. Stewart doesn't understand why Nightingale would bother noting them, since it's just a small-town deputy handing out routine crime calls. Stewart wonders if deep down, Nightingale saw these distress calls as being suggestive of paranormal activities. Day 3. Well, practically 4. Can't go on like this. Daylight is harsh when there's no sleep. Saw Lady Diogenes with her lamp in broad daylight. I forgot her real name. Got it written down somewhere. How to get Wake. Is someone hiding him? Extremism in the cause of sanity is no vice. Whatever it takes. Local head shrinker name keeps coming up. Hartman. Stewart mentions that Lady Diogenes refers to a Greek philosopher who walked around ancient Athens with a lamp during the day for the purpose of finding an honest man. He knows that he's referring to Cynthia Weaver, and also notes that Dr. Emil Hartman has been unresponsive to his interview requests. Day 4. Didn't sleep a wink. Scanner got weirder through the night. Wake is one elusive bugger. Is he the only one? Is it him holding up this whole house of cards? What'll happen when I pull? Wish I could be sure, but not to decide is to decide. I have to do what's necessary when the time comes. Feels like I'm alone in the wilderness here. Stewart wonders if Nightingale was pulled to Bright Falls for the same reasons that he was, by dreams and nightmares possibly. He believes that Nightingale was compelled by harder evidence than he has available to him. Day 4. Afternoon. A partner isn't like a co-worker or a friend or even a brother. He's your guardian, your keeper, your other wife. He keeps you on the dead straight, calls you on everything that the others let slide, and he has your back when the shooting starts. That's where I failed Finn. I owe it to him to keep going even when everything's gone dark. When the craziness back east started, he couldn't explain it either. That's when he needed me most, but I blew it. I have to make it right. Stewart is happy to see an entry that gets into the heart of Nightingale and provides some objective information about his motivations. He lost a partner in the line of duty, confirmed during Stewart's investigation, but the details around it remain murky. Nightingale holds himself responsible in some way. Could he have witnessed similar events before? Day 4, night. Hartman seems to be the big man on campus, very protective of his patients. Skim through his self-help book. What a load. He's got a sweet little racket going at the lodge. Gut tells me he's involved in all of this somehow. Going for a drive. Can't think in here. Am I going down like Finn? Not if I shoot first. Night, much later. Sounds are getting weirder all the time. Something's happening just out of town, out by some farm. Flashes of light too. Could be kids with firecrackers getting edgy and starting a barn fire. Probably ought to get some batteries for the stupid flashlight if there's time. Will I have it in me to do what's necessary when the time comes? This was the final entry by Nightingale, as we know what happens afterwards. He finds Alan and arrests him before the whole darkness thing at the jail. He conducted some interviews with people of the town over the course of 3 to 4 days that he stayed in Bright Falls. Some were more successful than others, but have included them all in the file book. I won't read them in their entirety like I did before, but instead give brief points on each of them. The first is a secret interview with Mott, where Nightingale found him in Elderwood National Park while looking for Alan Wake. Nightingale notices that Mott was in a fight, so this is likely shortly after Mott's first run-in with Alan. Nightingale asks if he has seen Alan or noticed anything weird, to which Mott tells him that he needs to leave this whole thing alone, mentioning how he wished that he still had his gun on him, and flees shortly after while Nightingale tries to chase him through the woods, unsuccessfully, I might add. The next is Paul Randolph, the trailer park owner. They're arguing about the moment that Nightingale almost killed him during the shooting. Paul points out that people told him that Nightingale was drunk, to which he denies. He tells Paul that he knows he's a good guy and just asks for help to help him find the real bad guy, which is Alan, especially after what he did to Rose. Paul mentions how Alan and Barry were in her trailer for a long time before noticing where the conversation was going. He tells Nightingale that Rose is not that type of girl. Nightingale thinks that Rose might have been doing some business on the side, if you get my drift, but Paul denies it. He says that he's worked the whole day and he never saw them leave the trailer for anything, even a smoke. Nothing at all. He knew that Rose also skipped a day at her work as well, so he got worried. That's not like her. He got a hunch something was going on at the trailer and he called the sheriff. Nightingale went on to question Rose, and Stewart points out that Rose had difficulty focusing on the subject and it's unclear what happened to her. Remember, Rose was under the effect of Barbara at this time and was not herself. Nightingale asked her simple questions, to which Rose only answered with one word: okay. Rusty is brought up and Rose mentions that she likes Rusty since he didn't shout at her and she gave him free coffee at the diner. He asks her what happened to Rusty and Ellen, to which Rose goes off on a tangent about Ellen's new book being a roller coaster ride. She isn't sure if she's awake or dreaming. She's confused why it's nighttime. Rose mentions the lady that made her do these things. Nightingale asks her what the lady made her do or if Ellen hurt her. Rose denies Ellen ever hurting her, saying that she betrayed him and lied to him, and that she didn't want to. It wasn't her, she kept screaming, but her mouth wouldn't move. The woman twisted it. Nightingale asks if she's talking about Alice Wake, Ellen's wife, but Rose responds, the woman in black. Nightingale questions Rose if she's in a secret relationship with Ellen, to which she denies and begins to cry hysterically, saying that she isn't a bad person. She begins looking around, stunned by everything, saying that everything looks wrong and that the light hurts her eyes now. Nightingale apologizes to Rose and comforts her with a hug, telling her that everything will be okay. The next is Barry Wheeler, interviewed after being arrested at Rose's trailer. Nightingale questions Barry about his involvement with Ellen. Barry says that he's a friend and agent to Ellen. Nightingale mentions Alice and the fact that she is missing, but Barry answers this oddly and admits that he and Alice never really saw eye to eye, but Ellen is searching for her. Nightingale asks if there could have been maybe some marital issues, if Ellen could have hurt Alice, and now Barry is covering for him since he's acting so weird, suggesting if possibly even Alice and Barry were having an affair and maybe Ellen found out about it. Barry calls Nightingale out, saying that he has been given some bad coffee from Rose and passed out, and now he has to wake up and listen to all this crazy talk. He is the victim, for God's sake. Nightingale says that he doesn't care about that and only wants to know where Alan Wake is. Barry has a field day with this, as he begins threatening legal action with his lawyers. He tells Nightingale that he wasn't even read his rights, to which Nightingale mentions that Barry was never under arrest, to which Barry gets up and leaves. The next interview is Pat Main, after the radio station shooting. Pat mentions that he is only being interviewed by Nightingale because Sarah told him to, saying that he will not take any crap from Nightingale after what just happened earlier. Nightingale said it was a misunderstanding, to which Pat reinforces that it was reckless, dangerous, and most importantly, stupid. Nightingale asks what Ellen wanted with Pat, to which Pat responds that he had no time to talk when Ellen was there due to the interruption. They have a disagreement about Ellen's true nature. Pat believes that he's an okay man that seems fine, while Nightingale sees him as dangerous and unhinged. Nightingale pleads with Pat to help him, but Pat refuses, saying that he doesn't trust the agent. In fact, Nightingale seems more like a loose cannon than Alan Wake does. The final interview is with Emil Hartman. This took place when Nightingale came to the lodge in search for Ellen, something that we also found on the other end in the recordings at the lodge. Hartman points out that he knows more about Nightingale than he realizes, saying that he has a tendency to throw his gun around, not to mention his alcohol abuse. Hartman suggests Nightingale seek help to deal with his impulses. Nightingale feels strongly that Ellen is in the lodge and threatens to bust through the gate. Hartman mentions how he is recording this entire conversation, the same one that we found earlier, and an open threat like Nightingale just gave could find him in some hot water. Nightingale concedes and gets back into the car, screaming and hitting his car steering wheel in rage before turning off the recording device. Now there is a bunch more stuff like some manuscripts and even entire stories from Alan Wake's Alex Casey stories, and even Emil Hartman's books as well, which I'm not going to go over as it's not critical to the main story that we're getting into. But if you would like to go a step further and read this yourself, be sure to check out the Alan Wake Files book. This is not sponsored, by the way. There is a segment also that goes into the strange things that go on at Bright Falls, such as some Bigfoot sightings, a dark cloud, sightings of a feathered serpent, bit of an odd one. Of course, your normal shadow creatures that have been seen around the town, strange lights in the sky. It talks about the tale of the scratching hag, which we found out to be Barbara Jagger. It also talks of the volcanic eruption that took place in 1970, and that it was caused by a 7.3 earthquake, with the epicenter being directly below Cauldron Lake. An obituary for Barbara Jagger can be found in the newspaper. It speaks about how she would actually do bake giveaways for the town, showing just how kind and giving she was as a person, a stark contrast to the darkness version of her. Stewart put in for a POIA for Agent Nightingale, which stands for a Freedom of Information Act. The FBI responded to him saying that they can't furnish any records on Nightingale as there is an ongoing investigation on an unrelated matter. They mentioned that Nightingale is no longer working for the FBI, saying that as of 13 months ago, Nightingale's partner was killed in the line of duty. The trauma of this event caused Nightingale to have a sort of severe mental breakdown, and he gained a substance abuse problem as a result. He ventured to Bright Falls after his discharge from the Bureau, but they make it clear that they had no knowledge of or bear no responsibility for anything that he did there. They also have no files relating to any shadow men, lake creatures, ravenous crows, or any other bizarre supernatural fauna that Stewart described. Nightingale's current whereabouts are also listed as unknown. This confirms that Nightingale was not on official business when in Bright Falls, much like Sarah assumed. But it does beg to question what the unrelated investigation is about. To end the book, Stewart mentions his journey to find answers to his nightmares came at a huge personal cost. He lost his job and was not able to provide for his family. He has never been this estranged from his wife that he loved since he was 19 years old. His wife told him the day that he left for Bright Falls that if he left, she and their son would not be there for him when he returned, but he went anyway. He verified that his dreams were real and had some meaning. He is unsure if Alan Wake is dead, missing, or possibly in hiding, but he thought he did see Alan when he walked into the Elderwood Trail. He calls out to Alan, who was walking at a consistent pace, but no matter what Stewart did, he could never catch up to him. There was a brief moment that Alan turned around and smiled at Stewart. It was him, but when Stewart got close to him, he disappeared, possibly suggesting that this could have been Mr. Scratch. Stewart stayed in Bright Falls for weeks, helping to rebuild the Elderwood Visitor Centre that was damaged from the bad weather. He was unable to find Nightingale, and mentions that his dreams have stopped and considers his part in all of this as complete. Before leaving Bright Falls, he threw his dream journal into Cauldron Lake, returning his visions to its source. He returned home looking for his wife and son, but the apartment was empty, and his wife's family wouldn't take his calls. He was abandoned and alone. It took him an entire year to make contact with his wife again. He now works as an assistant at a university library, before mentioning that when he goes home and sees the smile on his wife and son's face, he is awash with the light and warmth of 1,000 suns. He is untouchable, alive. He walks in the light. You still with me? Not much longer to go, but we have a couple of comics to go over. Firstly, the Psycho Thriller comic. This takes place during the events that took place at Cauldron Lake Lodge when it was attacked by the Dark Presence in episode 4. After Alan Wake locked Hartman in his office to be attacked by the darkness, he was unconscious for a full day. When he awoke and exited the lodge, he found his nurse being attacked by Mott, who had been turned into a Taken. Hartman managed to use a flashlight to ward off Mott and save the nurse in the process. They look through the damaged ruins of the lodge and find a patient of theirs, Rudolph Lane. He was the painter that Alan spoke to during his time there. Mott breaks into the room and seemingly kills Rudolph while Hartman and nurse Sinclair escape. Mott follows them, but Hartman and Sinclair manage to lock themselves inside, barricading the door. Some police cars pull up and scare Mott away. It turns out to be Deputy Mulligan and Deputy Thornton. Hartman fills them in about Mott and they devise a plan to defeat him. Hartman uses himself as bait near the sundial, and when Mott arrives, he attempts to calm down the frantic and confused Mott, saying that he is proud of the work that Mott did for him over the years. He throws a flare at Mott and tells the deputies to open fire on him, to which Mott's body is destroyed in the process. The deputies want to question Hartman, but he refuses. Sinclair is taken home by the deputies while Hartman stays behind at the lodge to pack his things. He speaks to an unknown person on the phone and says that he has reconsidered their offer. He thinks about Thomas Zane and just how much he misses him. Now we have the second Night Springs comic. Remember when I mentioned how the people Barry called for Sarah had more meaning than you realized? This is it. This is what happened when Barry made those phone calls. It begins with Frank Breaker, Sarah's father, receiving the call from Barry as he is told the code word, Night Springs, over the phone. Knowing what this means, he grabs a flashlight and heads into Bright Falls. He calls a man named Kirkland and recalls some strange encounters that he had while in Bright Falls all those years ago, including a wolf man and even the ghost of his deceased wife. When he arrives, he finds Pat Main, Deputy Thornton, Deputy Mulligan, Deputy Grant and Deputy James. They talk about the shadow people they have encountered, and even cars with no drivers running people over. Frank asks about his daughter and is told that she is with Alan Wake heading to the power plant via a helicopter. He heads towards the power plant and finds it empty, but notices an open hatch that he believes that they've entered. He knows that that leads to the dam. He drives to the dam, dealing with Taken along the way. He's rammed by an empty truck, and as the car comes to a stop, a woman in black appears in front of him, telling him that if Sarah protects Alan Wake, she will die. Frank attacks the woman, but she disappears. He is completely surrounded by Taken, to which he attempts to fight off but is overwhelmed. The moment before he is about to be killed, the world turns to daylight suddenly. This is the moment that Alan pressed the clicker in the well-lit room, confirming Alan's theory that it did indeed turn night into day. Frank gets back into his car and gets to the dam and the well-lit room. He spots Alan running out of the room as he enters, finding Cynthia Weaver, Barry and his daughter Sarah inside the room and finally being reunited again. And with that, we get some references to go over. Firstly, the game Control. Now, this game takes place within the same universe as Alan Wake, and in the AWE DLC, we see Alan Wake. We can see Alan writing on his typewriter, writing out a narrative for the main character of Control, Jesse Faden. Wake can be seen speaking to a man. He introduces himself as Thomas Zane. Alan points out that Zane looks different and why he doesn't have the suit like normal. Zane tells him that it was just a role, a character, a protagonist that he played in an old film of his. He says that he's a filmmaker and that Alan and himself are working on a film together, an artistic collaboration. Night Springs can be seen on the television as Alan is struggling to understand what's happening. Alan mentions the darkness, to which Zane tells him that he has been writing and has found a way out of the dark place. They're close now. Alan tells Thomas Zane about his double being out there, to which Thomas assures Alan that it's fine and that he's dealing with it, not to worry. Alan gets angry that Thomas has met his double as the vision ends for Faden. Faden mentions that she knows who Alan Wake is, that he's the famous writer that went missing years ago. It was all over the news back then. She gets another vision of Alan writing as he name drops Hartman, saying that he needs to break through the reality and create the mystery. She finds another door as Alan can be heard crying. He says that he's forgotten again. He had a plan, but he's forgotten it. Alan feels that he's coming back and that he needs to get out of here. He needs to dive deeper. Wake is falling to madness again, and he needed to write in his escape. To do this, he would convey an alien force mimicking human intelligence into his government agency story, to act as a hero, his savior. See, let me give some extra context. I will keep this brief since this is not explaining the entire story of Control, but if you guys would like to see that, let me know in the comments down below. Faden works for the FBC, better known as the Federal Bureau of Control. They're responsible for investigating, containing, studying, and ultimately controlling paranatural phenomena across the United States. Following the events of Alan Wake 1 and after the psycho thriller comic, Hartman tried to exploit the power of the lake and was confronted and arrested by agents of the FBC. They confiscated Hartman's research of the lake, and as a last-ditch effort from Hartman, he jumped into Cauldron Lake and was possessed by the Dark Presence. He was captured by the FBC and brought into the Oldest House, who attempted to contain him in the investigations sector. Hartman, however, managed to breach the containment, and the FBC was forced to abandon the whole sector. Now, stay with me here. Something called the Hiss, which you learn about in the Control story, is sort of a paranatural force of interdimensional resonance. It can possess people and objects. It's very dangerous. Anyway, the Hiss mixed with the Dark Presence within Hartman, causing him to become a monstrosity. Faden is summoned to the sector by an apparition of Alan Wake, which we saw earlier. Faden is attempting to restore the sector and destroy Hartman in the process. She learns that Alan Wake is responsible for unleashing Hartman using his writing power to warp reality using fiction. It's implied to Faden that Alan was also responsible for the FDC and the Hiss invasion, as they both act as the hero in the crisis that he mentioned earlier, creating Jesse Faden to act as the hero in his escape from Cauldron Lake. Jesse reaches Hartman and destroys him, before being informed that the AWE event has been detected. AWE stands for Altered World Event, but a new AWE event has been detected in Bright Falls, the date of which is several years into the future. There is also a man named Dylan that explains to Faden about a dream that he has. A man called Mr. Door was found in a dark place. Mr. Door told Dylan that there are many worlds side by side. Some are even on top of each other and in some cases inside of one another. In one world there's a writer who wrote a story about a cop. In another world, the cop was real. This is in reference to Alex Casey, the cop that was written by writer Alan Wake. Door said that he was in all of these worlds at the same time, shifting between them endlessly, giving us a cliffhanger for Alan Wake 2, to which we will learn much more about these things that were mentioned. The ones within Quantum Break are much more akin to Easter eggs, more than actual clear signs that they exist within the same world, but I felt it was worth mentioning. You can find discussions on Alan Wake and the goings-on at Bright Falls on a chalkboard, including a signed Alan Wake book for Emily Burke, the main character's wife. And that pretty much wraps up the entire video of Alan Wake 1 and the events in between Alan Wake 2. I'll be covering Alan Wake, American Nightmare, and of course Alan Wake 2 next. I hope you enjoyed the video. I put a lot of time and research into making it, so I hope it filled in any questions that you might have had about the story. I really appreciate it if you enjoyed the video to leave a like down below, maybe even subscribe if you want to see more content like this in the future. Also, let me know if you want to see a Control story explained. Alright guys, thanks again. Until next time, peace.